Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Owen Fairclough. Our guest today is an economist widely credited with predicting the global economic crisis of 2007 and 2008, years before it happened. Many governments failed to listen to him then. They don't now. Professor Nouriel Roubini is now courted by leaders around the world for his views on the global economic crisis. Professor Roubini, many thanks indeed for joining us. We're in the rather tropical surroundings of Gabon, but I have to start by asking you about Spain. I don't think I'm the only one that's confused. Is it a bailout for this country? Are we talking about the fourth eurozone country that has now been bailed out?
Effectively, it is a bailout. They're trying to limit the bailout only to the banks rather than the sovereign. But the reality is that the EFSF or ESM is going to lend money to the government, is going to use these funds to recapitalize their own banks that have massive losses that have to be recapitalized. So it is the fourth one among these countries that is receiving now a bailout.
For people who perhaps don't understand all these different mechanisms, these different bailout funds, what does it matter that it's one particular bailout fund, and why does that matter for the banks that are at the heart of this banking crisis in Spain?
Well, the banks had massive losses on their real estate loans. There was a bubble that went bust, and now the government, unfortunately, cannot borrow at interest rates that are sensible in the international capital markets. Therefore, it's becoming unsustainable, the deficit and debt of the country. The advantage of relying on the official sector, EU funds or IMF, is that they can borrow at a cheaper rate at a level is going to be more sustainable for Spain.
Is this a good solution for this country? It was perhaps inevitable that they would have to recourse to some sort of bailout. Is this the best solution?
Well, at this point, a bailout for Spain or its bank became necessary. I think that the form of the bailout is not ideal, because what happened is that the government is going to borrow from the EU fund and then use it to recapitalize the banks, but then the stock of the public debt of the government is going to become higher. And the same thing happened in the case of Greece and Ireland. You took the banking losses, you socialized the losses, you put them on the balance sheet of the government, then the government became unsustainable debt, and since a large part of the public debt is held by the banks, the banking risk became sovereign risk, and now the sovereign risk becomes banking risk. I think the better solution would have been for a direct injection of capital from these EU funds into the banks, bypassing the sovereign. For many political reasons, it was decided not to go this way, so the form of the bailout in some sense is not ideal.
And that's the point, isn't it, that politics here is mixing with finance and economics in a way that perhaps is not unprecedented, but is not helpful.
Yeah, it's not helpful because the Europeans have been behind the curve. You know, they've had 18 summits of the leaders in the last 2 years, and the headlines in the newspaper after the last summit was EU leaders decide to postpone key decisions, and they're going to have another summit at the end of June. The trouble is you have 17 countries in the eurozone, 17 governments, 17 coalitions. They cannot even agree within their own coalitions, even in the case of Germany, let alone to agree with the opposition agreeing at the European level. So until now, they've been behind the curve. Every time they say we have a plan to solve the crisis is becoming worse. The fiscal crisis, the economic crisis, the banking crisis. This is a serious time for the eurozone. The recession is getting worse, and unfortunately, we don't have yet a vision, a cohesive plan to resolve these problems once and for all.
You've often said that Greece will exit the eurozone, exit the euro at least, within the next 12 months or so. Do you still think that's the case, or has the focus now shifted to Spain, the country we all thought was too big to fail and too big to save?
Well, both countries are in trouble in different ways. Greece already lost market access at the bailout that failed, the second bailout, a course of debt restructuring. The next step is going to be exit. In my view, the exit could occur even this year if the opposition party wins and they decide not to compromise with the Troika. But it's going to happen next year regardless of, because the recession in Greece is becoming a depression. Now, however, of course, people are worried more about Spain, Greece is only 2% of the Eurozone GDP. Italy and Spain are the third and fourth largest members of the Eurozone. If they lose market access, if they need a bailout, if the bailout is botched and fails, and eventually have a debt restructuring, let alone exit, that could be the breakup of the Eurozone. Of course, not this year, but over an horizon of the next 3-4 years, that situation could materialize.
And that chimes with a lot of predictions, certainly that I've read, that have said this won't be almost like a slow motion car crash that this EU breakup, if it happens, wouldn't be something that would happen overnight. We're talking about something that could happen over the next maybe 3 to 5 years. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, it's a slow motion train crash or car crash in the sense that there are 6 countries in trouble: Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Cyprus. There are different stages of economic trouble. Some of them, like Greece, Ireland, Portugal, already lost market access and have gone through a bailout. Some of them have gone through a bailout that failed and got a second bailout. Some of them, like Greece, already had to restructure their public debt. Some of them, like Greece, are on the verge of exiting. Other ones are on the verge of requiring a debt restructuring. Other ones, like Spain and maybe Italy, are going to need a bailout. So it's a slow motion in which sequentially different countries get to different situations of distress on the banks, on the government, on the country that require certain action or other ones. So it's not all at once a collapse of the eurozone, but over time, if many more countries are going to get in trouble and not resolve their problem, a breakup of the eurozone becomes more likely.
You wrote recently that you think Germany is risking failing or risks failing to learn the lessons from the 1930s, of course, when we saw hyperinflation, the Weimar Republic, the rise of Nazism. What do you mean by that when you say it risks failing to learn those lessons?
Well, in the Great Depression, we had botched economic policy. There was fiscal tightening. They didn't move away from gold standard and fixed exchange rates. They didn't fix the banks. And then in 1931, with the collapse of the Austrian bank, credit unstalled, the beginning of bank runs throughout Europe occurred that led the great crash of 29 to become a Great Depression. Today, we have the same problem. I think that while fiscal austerity and structural reform are necessary, we need a European Central Bank to cut interest rates and print money. We need a euro weaker. But just this past week, the ECB decided to keep interest rates on all the not printing money. In addition to a fiscal compact, we need a growth compact, because if you don't jumpstart economic growth, the recession becomes deeper, the social backlash against austerity becomes too severe, the debt becomes unsustainable. We need now to stop and reverse this process of fragmentation, disintegration, and balkanization of the banking system, where money is now being rolled off, and now it's a severe problem. We need eventually a fiscal union and debt mutualization with Eurobonds. Unless all these things are accepted by Germany, this unstable disequilibrium could lead to a disintegration and fragmentation and a breakup of the Eurozone.
You mentioned that. Could that be accelerated by these elections in Greece? You think next year, but many people would say this is moving so quickly that it's possible to envisage Greece leaving the Eurozone over the summer, perhaps?
It's possible if the opposition wins in Greece and there is not an agreement between what the opposition is willing to compromise and what the Troika is willing to compromise. It's possible that the IMF, EU, ECB program is pulled off. At that point, Greece doesn't have money to pay its bills. They default. At that point, they have to print money to avoid the bank run. They have to print money to finance the deficit. Therefore, they go to a drachma. If they go to a drachma, they have to redenominate all their euro deposits into drachma. Then people in Spain and Italy are going to say, who's going to be next? Maybe me, maybe my deposits are not safe. And this kind of a roll-off of the interbank lines or the cross-border, they start to become a bank jog, could become a full bank run also in the rest of the Eurozone, and that could lead to a breakup.
And we're already seeing that in Greece, something like 100 billion euros withdrawn over the last 12 months or so. It's maybe not a bank run, but a bank jog, as you call it. Is that the reality?
Yeah, and it could become a full-fledged bank run, because if there is going to be a risk of exit, two things are going to happen to the depositors. One, a deposit freeze. You cannot take your money out of the banks. It happened in Argentina in 2002. Two, a coercive redenomination of euro deposits into new drachma. That's what Argentina did in 2002 with the pacification of their own liabilities. So if that happens, a euro in a Greek bank today is not the same thing as a euro in a German bank. And once that occurs in Greece, people are going to ask who's going to be next. Portugal, Cyprus, Italy, and Spain, and you could have a generalized run throughout the Eurozone. If there is one thing to destroy the Eurozone, it's not a slow motion recession, but rather a bank run and a balkanization and disintegration of the banking system.
Let's talk about a positive growth story. We're here in Gabon. We're both getting battered a little bit by some of these falling leaves from this tree. Where do you see the story for Africa going, Professor Rubini? We've heard an awful lot about the growth story. Many sub-Saharan countries in Africa have around 5% growth. Eurozone economies would give their eye teeth for those kind of figures right now. Where do you see things going in Africa?
Well, I see many positive growth stories in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. It's in West Africa, from Gabon to Ghana to Nigeria, to East Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, to Southern Africa, countries like South Africa, Botswana, Angola, Mozambique. So In the past, Africa was a continent where there was poverty, underdevelopment trap, civil war, diseases. Gradually, not everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, but in many of these parts of sub-Saharan Africa, better institutions, better government, better policies. Now with the resource boom, they can exploit the resource boom, and they're growing at a respectable rates between 4.5% to 5%. That's the positive. The risk is that if the eurozone goes into a deep crisis, if the US growth goes into a stall speed, if China, rather than having a soft landing, has a hard landing through trade links and financial links, then growth in sub-Saharan Africa could be significantly damaged.
Do they really need Europe, though? Can't these African countries and China just quietly get on with trading with each other? We've seen some huge figures and some $200 billion forecast in trade between these two places over the next year or so. That's a huge amount. Can't they just get on quietly and trade with each other and not need to worry about Europe?
Well, you know, the amount of their export to Europe has shrunk now to 40% of their export to about a quarter, but they still depend on exports to Europe. They depend very much on also China for foreign direct investment, for loans, for aid, and for exports. And both eurozone, now in a severe crisis, China slowing down, are potential downside risk. Over time, of course, you have a continent of 1 billion people, trade, financial relations within the continent, more trade integration is going to lead to more within the region kind of trade and economic activity. But certainly, when the rest of the world sneezes, sub-Saharan Africa catches the cold. That's still the reality.
Professor Nurubbini, many thanks indeed for joining us. We're out of time. That's it for this edition of the programme. Coming up, more news here on France 24.